The summer air hung thick and heavy over the Roanoke Colony, the smell of salt water and pine blending with the faint tang of desperation. Every creak of a wagon wheel and every clatter of a hammer seemed to carry a note of urgency. The colonist boy, Nathaniel, stood at the edge of the settlement, his hands gripping a half-carved plank for the stockade. At 18, his shoulders were still narrow, his face unlined by years, but his eyes carried the burden of too many days gone hungry. He stared into the dense line of trees at the edge of the colony, where shadows played tricks on his mind. Somewhere beyond that boundary was danger. He'd heard the whispers from his father and the other men, how the native tribes nearby were growing restless. Supplies were low, trust was thinner. Nathaniel's father often spat when he spoke of the savages, but Nathaniel had seen them once, just briefly, a hunting party passing near the settlement. One boy among them wasn't much older than him, with fierce eyes and a defiant posture. Their gazes had locked for a moment too long, and Nathaniel couldn't explain why it had made him feel more curious than afraid. Far away from the colony, on the other side of those trees, Ahanu crouched by the river's edge. His reflection rippled in the water as he ran his fingers over the edge of a spear. 18 winters old, Ahanu bore the weight of being his father's only surviving son. The colonists were like a sickness, his father had said, a sickness that would spread if not contained. Ahanu had seen the proof. Clearings where the trees were hacked down, rivers clogged with silt from their digging. Yet he couldn't forget the pale boy he'd glimpsed in the distance, the one with wide eyes that spoke more of fear than malice. Ahanu stood, his gaze drawn to the horizon where the sun was dipping low. There was a tension in the air that set his teeth on edge, a feeling that something was coming. He adjusted the strap of his satchel and began his walk back to his village, where his father's warnings would soon become commands. Back in the colony, Nathaniel turned toward the stockade, where his father called his name in a voice that brooked no delay. Another day of labour stretched ahead, but Nathaniel's thoughts lingered on the boy from the woods. The distance between their worlds felt insurmountable, yet something about that fleeting connection made him wonder what lay beyond the forest. Unbeknownst to both, the fragile thread connecting their lives would soon be pulled taut, dragging them into a story of loss, survival, and an unexpected kind of love. The night it all began, the moon hung like a pale wound in the sky, its light bleeding down through the branches. Nathaniel had trouble sleeping, as he often did. His father's gruff words earlier still rattled in his mind. "Stay vigilant, boy. The savages aren't waiting for an invitation." He lay on the hard cot, staring at the shadows on the wooden beams above, listening to the wind rattle the loose boards of the stockade. Somewhere in the distance an owl cried, a low haunting sound. Then came the shouting. It started as a single voice, panicked and sharp, then rose into a cacophony of cries. Nathaniel bolted upright, his heart pounding. Grabbing his lantern, he stumbled out of the small hut, the sudden rush of cold night air making him shiver. The scene outside was chaos. Men running to and fro, muskets in hand, women herding children toward the central square. Flames licked the edges of the stockade, casting wild shadows over the scene. "The natives are attacking," someone shouted. Nathaniel's stomach dropped. He turned to his father, who was shoving a musket into his hands. "Protect your mother and sister," his father barked, before running off toward the gates. Nathaniel stood frozen, the weight of the musket foreign and cold in his hands. In the distance, war cries echoed through the night, blending with the terrified screams of the colonists. The stockade gate splintered under the force of an attack, and chaos surged inward. Ahanu moved like a shadow among the trees, his spear clenched tightly in his hand. His father had led the charge, fueled by weeks of anger over the colonists' encroachments. Tonight, they would send a message, one the settlers would not forget. Ahanu's heart pounded in his chest as he followed the others, their painted faces glowing in the firelight as they swept through the settlement. But as they reached the colony, something went wrong. The colonists fought back harder than expected, muskets flaring bright in the dark. Screams of pain rang out, not just from the settlers but from his own people. Ahanu's breath hitched as he saw his father fall, struck down by a musket ball. For a moment everything else blurred, the fighting, the fire, the noise. Only his father's crumpled form on the ground remained in focus. With a cry, Ahanu rushed forward only to stumble over another body. A colonist, barely older than him. Blood stained the ground, mixing with ash and dirt, and the stench of death filled the air. By dawn it was over. The fires had burned themselves out, leaving the colony in smouldering ruins. Nathaniel staggered through the wreckage, his hands trembling as he pushed aside fallen beams and charred debris. His family's hut was gone, reduced to little more than ash and fragments of wood. His mother and sister were nowhere to be found, and his father's lifeless body lay not far from the stockade wall, face down in the dirt. He sank to his knees, numb and hollow. Around him, the settlement was eerily quiet. The screams of the night had faded into the soft crackle of dying embers. He wasn't sure if anyone else had survived. Then, movement. Nathaniel's head snapped up. At the edge of the forest, a figure appeared, limping but still upright. The native boy, the one from the woods. His face was streaked with ash and blood, his eyes wild but alert. A spear hung loosely in his hand, its tip broken, and he stumbled as he walked. The two locked eyes again, just as they had before, but this time there was no curiosity, no fleeting connection, only pain and anger. Nathaniel rose slowly, gripping the musket in his hand. He didn't raise it, but he didn't let go either. The boy paused, swaying on his feet, his expression unreadable. Neither moved for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a soft grunt, the native boy collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Nathaniel hesitated, the musket shaking in his grip. He could finish this, end the last remnant of the enemy that had taken everything from him, but instead he found himself kneeling down, his fingers trembling as he pressed them to the boy's neck. The pulse beneath his fingers was weak but steady. Something in Nathaniel broke then. Not his hatred, not yet, but something deeper. He couldn't leave the boy to die, not like this. Slinging the musket over his shoulder, he grabbed the boy under the arms and began dragging him toward what was left of the colony. The boy stirred long before dawn, his body rigid with tension as his eyes fluttered open. Nathaniel sat a few feet away, his musket propped against his knee, staring into the faint glow of the embers. The two stared at each other for a long, charged moment. When the native boy, Ahanu, Nathaniel would later learn, tried to rise, Nathaniel raised the musket instinctively, his knuckles white around the barrel. "Don't," Nathaniel warned, his voice low and uneven. Ahanu froze, his breathing heavy. Though he didn't understand the words, the meaning was clear. His dark eyes darted to the musket and then back to Nathaniel's face, narrowing in defiance. "Where do you think you're going?" Nathaniel asked, his voice harder now. He didn't expect an answer, but the words filled the silence. Ahanu gestured weakly to the forest, his face tight with pain. He shifted his weight to stand, but his leg buckled beneath him, and he collapsed with a grunt. That's when Nathaniel noticed the dark stain spreading across the boy's thigh, a wound he hadn't seen in the chaos of the night. "Damn it," Nathaniel muttered. He should have left him. His father's voice echoed in his head. "They're animals, Nathaniel. You show them mercy, and they'll take your throat." But the boy wasn't attacking him now. He was just broken. And Nathaniel, despite the knot of anger in his chest, couldn't let him die. Not like this. The sun rose slowly over a scene of mutual resentment. Nathaniel cleaned and bandaged Ahanu's leg with the supplies he salvaged, though Ahanu flinched and hissed at every touch. The process was clumsy, punctuated by scowls and sharp glares, but Nathaniel pressed on. Ahanu was weak, unable to stand, let alone escape. Still, Nathaniel kept his musket close, a constant reminder of where they stood. They exchanged few words, mostly unintelligible attempts on Nathaniel's part to issue commands. "Sit. Stay there. Don't move," none of which Ahanu appeared to respect. The first day passed in tense silence. Nathaniel scavenged what he could from the ruins of the colony, salted fish from a burnt storage shed, a tattered blanket from what was left of his neighbour's home. He shared the food grudgingly, tossing a piece of fish toward Ahanu without looking at him. Ahanu refused at first, glaring in stony silence. Hunger, however, eventually won out, and he ate in slow, deliberate bites, never breaking eye contact with Nathaniel. On the third day, the silence cracked. Nathaniel had been mumbling to himself, a habit born of loneliness, as he struggled to patch the roof of a makeshift shelter. "This'll never hold," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Ahanu, sitting by the fire, made a sound, a short, sharp laugh. Nathaniel whipped around, glaring. "What's so funny?" he snapped. Ahanu didn't answer, of course, but the glint in his eyes said enough. Nathaniel huffed, turning back to his work, but the moment lingered. For the first time, the air between them felt less sharp, if only slightly. That night, Nathaniel tried again. Holding up a piece of fish, he pointed to it and said, "Fish." Ahanu stared at him, unamused. "Fish," Nathaniel repeated, slower, as if volume or pace would bridge the gap. Ahanu raised an eyebrow and muttered something in his own tongue, his tone flat. Nathaniel sighed. "Yeah, I didn't think so." But the next day, when Nathaniel pointed at the fish again and said the word, Ahanu repeated it, his voice halting and unsure. Nathaniel blinked in surprise, then nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "Fish." The tentative truce grew slowly. Ahanu began gesturing when he needed something, and Nathaniel did his best to understand. When Ahanu pointed toward the forest one evening, Nathaniel hesitated, but eventually followed the direction, returning with berries that Ahanu deemed acceptable with a curt nod. Still, mistrust lingered. At night, Nathaniel slept with one hand on his musket, and Ahanu kept a sharp rock hidden in his lap when Nathaniel wasn't looking. Their movements were careful, calculated, like two animals circling the same waterhole. But as the days turned into weeks, the necessity of survival chipped away at the walls between them. When Nathaniel stumbled into a thicket of thorns, Ahanu barked a sharp word and guided him around it. When Ahanu's fever spiked one night, Nathaniel stayed up to cool his forehead with water, murmuring reassurances he knew Ahanu couldn't understand. Little by little they learned to live together. Nathaniel taught Ahanu simple English words: water, fire, shelter, while Ahanu showed him how to forage and set traps. Their mutual need overrode their differences, but something deeper was beginning to take root, though neither dared to acknowledge it. They were no longer just enemies, but what they were now neither could say. The decision to leave the ruins of Roanoke was made without words. One morning, as Nathaniel scanned the tree line with tired eyes, Ahanu gestured sharply toward the horizon. His tone was urgent, his words rapid, but the meaning was unmistakable. Staying here was no longer a possibility. Nathaniel didn't need convincing. The signs were all around: ashes growing cold, the stores of food nearly gone, and a sense of isolation that pressed on him like a heavy fog. He glanced at Ahanu's leg, now healed enough for him to walk with a limp, and nodded. "Croatoan," he said, the word heavy on his tongue. It was the only place he knew to go, a name he'd overheard from settlers who once spoke of the nearby island as both a haven and a mystery. Ahanu seemed to understand. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened in quiet resolve. Together, they packed what little they had: a battered satchel with a few provisions, Nathaniel's musket, and a makeshift spear Ahanu had carved from a branch. The journey to the coast was grueling. The forest was dense, the paths treacherous, and the weight of unspoken grievances hung between them like a storm cloud. At first, they moved in silence, Nathaniel leading while Ahanu followed a few paces behind, his eyes darting to every rustling leaf. The tension between them had softened over the weeks, but the wounds of their past still bled beneath the surface. When Nathaniel stumbled over a root one afternoon, falling hard onto his hands and knees, Ahanu let out a quiet snort of laughter. "Glad you find this funny," Nathaniel grumbled, brushing dirt from his palms. Ahanu mimicked Nathaniel's clumsy fall with exaggerated gestures, shaking his head in mock disbelief. Nathaniel glared, then surprised himself with a begrudging laugh. All right, I get it. I'm hopeless in the woods." He extended a hand in a gesture of truce. Ahanu hesitated but eventually grasped Nathaniel's arm, helping him to his feet. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the forest around them seemed to fall silent. By the time they reached the shoreline, exhaustion had taken its toll. They scavenged for food along the beach, collecting clams and seaweed to stave off hunger. Nathaniel tried to start a fire with damp driftwood, cursing under his breath as the sparks fizzled out. Ahanu watched silently for a moment before stepping forward, brushing Nathaniel aside. With practiced ease, he arranged the wood and struck his own fire starter, coaxing a flame to life. Nathaniel exhaled sharply, equal parts relieved and frustrated. "Show off," he muttered, but there was no malice in his tone. As the fire crackled, they sat shoulder to shoulder, staring out at the dark waves. Nathaniel broke the silence. "Why did you help me?" Ahanu glanced at him, his expression unreadable. He didn't answer right away, but after a long pause, he gestured toward the horizon. "Alone," he said in halting English. Nathaniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Ahanu placed a hand over his chest, then pointed to Nathaniel. "Alone. No good." The words were simple, but their meaning struck Nathaniel like a blow. For all their differences, all the pain between them, they were both just two boys left alone in a world that wanted to kill them. The crossing to Croatoan Island was the most dangerous part of their journey. They lashed together a crude raft from driftwood and vines, their movements clumsy and strained as the tide threatened to drag them back to shore. At one point, a strong wave nearly capsized them, and Nathaniel clung to the raft's edge with white-knuckled hands. Ahanu grabbed his arm, shouting over the roar of the surf. "Hold! I'm trying!" Nathaniel shouted back, his voice breaking. Somehow they made it, their raft scraping against the rocky shore of Croatoan Island, just as the first rays of dawn broke the sky. Soaked and shivering, they collapsed on the sand, their breaths ragged. Life on the island was no easier. Food was scarce, and the looming fear of rival tribes or colonist expeditions kept them on edge. Yet amid the hardship, their bond grew in quiet, unspoken ways. One night, Nathaniel carved a small bird from a piece of driftwood and placed it near Ahanu's bedroll. When Ahanu picked it up, he looked at Nathaniel with an expression that was equal parts confusion and gratitude. Ahanu later returned the gesture, leaving a woven bracelet of grass and bark near Nathaniel's belongings. It was crude but thoughtful, and Nathaniel wore it without a word. The tension between them wasn't gone, but it had shifted. It was no longer about survival alone. It was about something neither of them had words for yet. In stolen glances and fleeting touches, they began to see each other not as enemies, not even as mere allies, but as something more. Still, the unspoken weight of their pasts hung over them. Nathaniel often found himself staring out at the horizon, wondering if the English would ever return. Ahanu, too, seemed restless, his gaze drawn to the distant forest as if listening for echoes of a life he'd lost. They were together, but the question lingered. For how long? It started with the faint outline of sails on the horizon, white against the morning sky. Nathaniel spotted them first, his breath catching in his throat. He stood motionless at the edge of the beach, his heart pounding in disbelief. The English, they had come back. Ahanu appeared from the forest moments later, carrying a bundle of fresh firewood. He followed Nathaniel's gaze, his face darkening as he understood. The ships were heading toward the island. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, Ahanu's voice broke the silence, low and urgent. "We hide." Nathaniel didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the ships, his chest tightening with a mixture of longing and dread. A part of him yearned to run toward them, to shout and wave, to return to the world he'd been torn from. But another part, the the deeper part, felt something else entirely. A cold realization. If the English found him, they would find Ahanu too. They retreated into the dense forest, moving quickly but quietly, their steps in perfect rhythm. Nathaniel's mind raced as he followed Ahanu's lead. The English would search the island. They'd look for signs of the colony, for any survivors, for answers, and they would bring with them the same violence, the same fear that had destroyed Roanoke. Nathaniel couldn't let them find Ahanu. The two boys climbed a ridge overlooking the beach, crouching low among the thick ferns. From their vantage point, they could see the English ships dropping anchor. Small boats were lowered into the water, filled with armed men in heavy uniforms. Nathaniel recognized their polished muskets and gleaming armor. His people. Ahanu tensed beside him, his fingers gripping the handle of his spear. He glanced at Nathaniel, his expression a mixture of fear and determination. "They kill," he said quietly, his voice trembling with certainty. Nathaniel nodded, his throat tight. "I know." The English soldiers reached the shore and began their search methodically, spreading out in pairs. Nathaniel watched as they moved through the sand, their voices carrying faintly on the breeze. "Where are they?" one of the soldiers called, his tone impatient. "The colony was supposed to be here." "They could have fled inland," another replied. Nathaniel clenched his fists. Every instinct screamed at him to reveal himself, to run to them and explain everything. But as his gaze flicked to Ahanu, his dark eyes scanning the soldiers, his body coiled like a spring, Nathaniel knew he couldn't. The English would take Ahanu. They'd kill him without hesitation, and there would be nothing Nathaniel could do to stop them. Hours passed as the English searched the island, growing more frustrated by the minute. They found nothing but traces of old fires and abandoned shelters. Nathaniel and Ahanu stayed hidden, their breath shallow as soldiers came dangerously close to their hiding place. At one point, a soldier paused mere feet from their cover, his musket gleaming in the sunlight. Nathaniel's heart thundered in his chest. He felt Ahanu tense beside him, ready to fight if necessary, but the soldier moved on, cursing under his breath. When the soldiers finally regrouped on the beach, Nathaniel exhaled shakily, his hands trembling. The English leader, a tall man with a commanding voice, barked orders to his men. "There's nothing here. We'll report back to the Crown that the colony has vanished. Prepare to leave." Nathaniel watched as the soldiers filed back into their boats, their movements slow and weary. He felt a strange ache in his chest as the last boat pushed off from the shore, the men rowing back toward the distant ships, and he would never know what might have been. As the ships grew smaller on the horizon, Nathaniel and Ahanu stepped cautiously out of their hiding place. The beach was empty again, the only sound the gentle crash of waves against the shore. Nathaniel stared at the spot where the English had been, his chest heavy. He thought of his family, his people, the life he might have returned to. But then he looked at Ahanu, his sharp features softened by relief, his dark eyes meeting Nathaniel's with quiet understanding. Nathaniel nodded to himself. The English might have taken him back to a familiar world, but it wasn't his world anymore. "I stay," Nathaniel said softly, his voice steady. Ahanu smiled faintly, the tension in his shoulders easing. He reached out, placing a hand on Nathaniel's arm. "Together," he said simply. Nathaniel nodded. Together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the two boys walked away from the beach, their backs to the distant ships. Nathaniel felt the weight of his choice settle over him, not as a burden, but as a quiet resolve. The secrets of Roanoke and the life they'd built would stay with them. The world beyond might never understand, but that didn't matter. They had each other, and that was enough. The days after the English departure were quiet, the island returning to its natural rhythms. The only trace of their presence was the churned sand on the beach, quickly reclaimed by the tide. Nathaniel and Ahanu moved cautiously at first, scanning the horizon each day for the return of the ships. But as the weeks passed and the sea remained empty, A strange calm settled over them. The looming threat of discovery was gone, leaving only the two of them and the world they had to build. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the forest canopy, Nathaniel found a Hanu sitting by the shore. His spear rested against his shoulder, but he wasn't hunting. Instead, he was watching the waves, his expression serene. Nathaniel approached, his bare feet silent on the soft sand. "You're up early," he said, settling beside him. Ahanu glanced at him and smiled faintly. "Watch," he said, gesturing to the horizon. Nathaniel followed his gaze and saw a flock of birds soaring over the water, their wings catching the light. The sight was simple yet breathtaking, a reminder of the beauty in the world they now called home. "Peaceful," Nathaniel murmured. Ahanu nodded. "Good place." Nathaniel studied him for a moment, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and affection. For all they had endured, loss, pain, and the constant fear of the unknown, they had found something neither of them had expected, a place to belong. The days turned into weeks, and then months. Together, they learned to thrive on the island, combining their knowledge to build a life of quiet resilience. Nathaniel's traps grew more sophisticated, and Ahanu taught him to fish with a spear, laughing when Nathaniel fell into the water more often than not. In return, Nathaniel shared what he knew of construction, helping Ahanu fortify their small shelter against the coming winter. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized in a way that felt effortless, natural. The bond between them deepened, no longer defined by necessity alone. There were moments of quiet intimacy. The way Ahanu's hand would linger on Nathaniel's shoulder after a long day, or the soft, unguarded laughter they shared by the fire. One night, as they sat under the stars, Ahanu spoke quietly. "Alone before," he said, gesturing between them. "Not now." Nathaniel nodded, his chest tight. "Not now," he echoed. Seasons passed, and the island began to feel less like a refuge and more like a home. They marked time in the changing tides and the cycles of the moon, their old lives fading into distant memories. Occasionally, Nathaniel thought of the colony, the faces of those he had lost. He thought of the English ships, of the choice he'd made to remain hidden. There were no regrets. He glanced at Ahanu, who was tending to a small garden they had planted together. Ahanu caught Nathaniel's gaze and smiled, a smile that spoke of trust, of partnership, of love. This was where Nathaniel belonged. The years ahead were uncertain, filled with challenges they couldn't yet imagine. But they faced them together, hand in hand, carving out a life from the wild beauty of Croatoan Island. And as they watched the sun set over the water that evening, Nathaniel felt a quiet certainty in his heart. They had found something rare and enduring, something that no colony, no nation, no force in the world could take from them. They had found each other, and for this they were thankful.